Sell it, Ethan. Victor stood beneath the old wooden sign, smiling like 300 acres already belonged to him. These people can be placed somewhere appropriate. Ranger stepped onto the porch before Ethan could speak. No bark, no growl. Just one old German shepherd standing between a man with money and a home full of people he refused to call by name. Placed? Ethan said quietly. Victor shrugged. That's what they are, residents, expenses, bad math. Ethan looked toward the cottages glowing in the rain. No, he said. They have names. And that was the moment Hollow Creek Haven stopped being property. Ethan Mercer knew how to sit still while a room decided what he was worth. He had learned it in waiting rooms with bad coffee, in county offices where fluorescent lights made everyone look tired, in the quiet corners of hospitals where people spoke softly because death was close enough to hear its own name. But the lawyer's office on Beacon Street had a different kind of silence. It was polished, expensive. The kind of silence that came with walnut paneling, thick rugs, and people who had already counted money that did not yet belong to them. Outside, Boston was wrapped in a cold April rain, the windows silvered with water, the city moving on behind the glass as if Margaret Whittaker had not died 10 days earlier, with no one holding her hand except one tired nephew and an old German shepherd who refused to leave the foot of her bed. Margaret had been 79, stubborn as a locked gate, small in the shoulders by the end, but still sharp enough to correct Ethan's grammar when the pain medicine made the room tilt. Her estate, the papers said, was worth a little over $4 million. That number had changed the way people dressed for her funeral. It had changed the way they said her name. Ethan sat in the back row in a charcoal jacket that had belonged to better years, his hands resting loose on his knees, Ranger lying at his boots with his head up and his amber eyes watching the front of the room. Ranger was 8, broad-chested dark sable, with a gray wash along his muzzle and the steady patience of a creature who knew grief did not need to be hurried. In the front row sat Gordon Whittaker, Margaret's older brother, a man who had not visited her once during the last winter, but had brought a black umbrella large enough for photographs. Beside him, his wife Patricia kept one gloved hand on her purse as if grief might try to steal from her. Their nephew, Victor Langford, sat angled toward the table, smiling at nothing, his shoes too clean for the weather. The family lawyer, Mr. Alden, cleared his throat and began. His voice had no rough edges. It moved from bequest to bequest with the calm of a train that knew all its stops. The Boston townhouse, 3 floors of brick and ivy near the Common, went to Gordon. Patricia received the antiques, including the silver tea service she had always praised with a hunger she mistook for taste. Victor was granted the investment account, $1.1 million after fees and adjustments, under a clause Margaret had written 3 years before she got sick. No one gasped, no one wept. Gordon only lowered his chin once, as if accepting a compliment. Patricia blinked slowly. Victor's mouth curved, not enough to be called a smile, but enough for Ethan to see it. Ranger saw it too. The dog's ears shifted forward. Then Mr. Alden turned a page. The paper made a dry little sound in the room. And to my nephew Ethan Mercer, presently residing in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, I leave the sum of $2 United States dollars, contained in the envelope provided to him at this reading. For half a second, nobody moved. Then Victor laughed. It was not loud, not full, just a short, careless breath that escaped before manners could catch it. Patricia looked down at her lap, but her shoulders rose. Gordon turned halfway in his chair and let his eyes travel over Ethan's jacket, his worn shoes, the service dog at his feet. Well, Victor said, soft enough to pretend he had not meant the whole room to hear, guess that's what loyalty is worth these days. Ethan did not answer. Something in his chest tightened, not surprise exactly, because life had taught him not to expect fairness from rooms like this. It was smaller than surprise and older than anger, a quiet closing of some inner door. He reached for the envelope when the assistant brought it to him, plain white, thin, his name written in Margaret's careful hand. Ranger rose without command and stood beside his knee, his body still, his gaze fixed not on the envelope but on the people who had laughed. Ethan slid one hand over the dog's head, feeling the warm ridge of bone beneath the fur. It steadied him. Margaret had once told him that dignity was not silence. Dignity was knowing when silence was stronger than anything you could say. So he stood when the meeting ended. He did not shake hands. He did not ask questions. He did not look back when Victor murmured something to Patricia near the table. He simply walked out through the heavy glass door with Ranger at his side, the envelope folded inside his coat pocket like a joke he had not yet learned how to understand. Behind him, the family gathered around Mr. Alden with the bright, careful voices of people discussing property. Ahead of him, the elevator opened to a small brass-walled box, smelling faintly of rain and old perfume. Ethan stepped inside. Ranger stepped with him. As the doors closed, the dog leaned his shoulder against Ethan's leg, not asking for comfort, giving it. Ethan looked down at him and for the first time that day felt the smallest crack in the humiliation. Not hope, not yet. Only the sense that Margaret Whitaker had never done anything without a reason. Ethan did not open the envelope in Boston. He carried it through the rain, through the parking garage, through the long drive south, with Ranger asleep, but not really sleeping in the passenger seat, his ears twitching at every change in Ethan's breathing. The wipers dragged water across the windshield in tired half-circles. Traffic thinned after Worcester, then thickened again near the turnpike, red taillights stretching ahead like a string of warning lamps. Ethan kept both hands on the wheel. He had driven in worse weather. He had sat through worse rooms. But there was something about that plain white envelope in his coat pocket that made the car feel too small. $2. That was the number they had given him in front of everyone. $2 for 18 months of grocery runs. Late-night pharmacy calls, clean sheets, soup Margaret could barely swallow, and mornings when she would wake confused and ask whether the lilacs had bloomed yet. Though it was January, and everything outside was hard with frost, he had not done any of it for money. That was the part no one in that room would have understood. Duty was not always a flag or a uniform or a line on a service record. Sometimes duty was peeling an orange because someone's hands shook too badly. Sometimes it was listening to the same story 4 times and answering as if it were the first. Sometimes it was sitting beside a bed while the world shrank to the sound of a clock and a dog breathing at your feet. By the time Ethan reached Lancaster County, the rain had softened into mist. He parked behind the old shoe repair shop where he rented the apartment upstairs. The sign out front had been broken for years, half the letters dark, so at night it simply read Shoe Air, as if even the building had lost a piece of itself and kept working anyway. Ranger jumped down from the truck slowly, waited for Ethan to lock the door, then climbed the narrow wooden stairs ahead of him. The apartment smelled faintly of coffee, leather polish from the shop below, and the cedar soap Margaret used to insist he buy because a man ought to smell like a forest, not a hospital hallway. He hung his jacket on the chair instead of the hook, Ranger noticed. Ethan took the envelope from the inner pocket and laid it on the small kitchen table. For a while, he only looked at it. His name sat there in Margaret's handwriting, each letter disciplined and elegant. The handwriting of a woman who had balanced checkbooks in ink and wrote thank you notes even when her hands ached. Ethan touched the edge of the paper with 2 fingers. "Well," he said quietly, not sure whether he was speaking to Ranger or to the empty room. "You always did know how to make an entrance." Ranger came closer and sat beside the table, tail still, eyes fixed on the envelope. Ethan opened it carefully. Inside were 2 crisp $1 bills, new enough to feel almost ceremonial and nothing else. No note, no explanation, no apology tucked behind the insult. He let out a breath that might have become a laugh if it had found any humor on the way up. He turned the first bill over. Nothing. He turned the second one, and then his hand stopped. Along the white margin, in writing so small he nearly missed it, Margaret had written 2 words. Trust him. Ethan stared at them. The room seemed to narrow around the table. Trust him. Not them, not her, him. He read the words again, slower this time, as if the shape of them might change if he gave them enough patience. Ranger made a soft sound, not a bark, not a whine, just a low breath from deep in his chest. Ethan looked down. The old shepherd had moved closer. His chin rested now on Ethan's knee. Warm and heavy, his amber eyes lifted with that grave attention that had unsettled nurses, charmed strangers, and once made Margaret say, "That dog has better judgment than half the people I'm related to." Ethan swallowed. The memory came so clearly it hurt. Margaret in her blue robe, Ranger lying beside her chair, her fingers moving through the fur behind his ears. "When he stands between you and something," she had said one evening, "pay attention," Ethan had said. "He's a dog, Aunt Maggie," She had looked at him over her glasses. So are most angels, if God has any sense. Now the $2 lay on the table under the weak yellow kitchen light, and the insult from the morning no longer felt clean. It had edges beneath it, layers. Maybe Margaret had wanted him humiliated. No, not wanted, allowed. There was a difference. She had allowed the family to show themselves in a room where everyone thought the story ended. Ethan picked up the marked bill and held it closer. Ranger's tail tapped once against the floor. Trust him. Ethan rubbed his thumb along the ink, careful not to smudge it, though it had already dried long before Margaret died. Outside, a car passed through the mist, tires whispering on wet pavement. Downstairs, the old shop pipes clicked as the heat came on. Ethan folded the bill and put it back in the envelope, but before he could stand, Ranger lifted his head. His ears sharpened toward the door. Ethan listened. Nothing. Only the apartment settling, only the rain tapping the fire escape. Then Ranger rose and walked to the door, stopping inches from it. Body calm but certain. Ethan felt the back of his neck prickle. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. Ranger did not look back. He simply stood there, waiting, as if someone on the other side had been expected for years. Ethan kept one hand on Ranger's collar, not to hold him back, but because the warmth of the dog's neck reminded him to breathe. The apartment had gone very still. Even the pipes below seemed to have stopped their small metal complaints. Then came the knock. 3 taps, evenly spaced, gentle enough to be polite and certain enough to make Ethan understand that whoever stood outside had not come by mistake. Ranger did not bark. That was what unsettled Ethan most. He only stood with his ears forward, his body square to the door, not guarding, not greeting, but waiting. Ethan looked once at the envelope on the table, then crossed the room. Through the peephole, he saw a woman in a charcoal wool coat standing beneath the weak hallway light. She was older, somewhere in her 60s, with silver hair cut clean at her jaw and a leather satchel held close against her ribs. Rain darkened the shoulders of her coat. She did not shift her weight. She did not check her phone. She had the patience of someone who had waded through worse weather than this. Ethan opened the door halfway. Ranger stepped beside him, his shoulder brushing Ethan's knee. The woman looked first at Ethan, then at the dog, and something in her face softened before she corrected it. "Mr. Mercer," she said. Her voice was low, Boston-shaped, careful without being cold. "My name is Eleanor Price. I was Margaret Whitaker's private attorney for 24 years. Ethan did not move. The name meant nothing to him, but Ranger took one slow step forward and sniffed the air. Eleanor lowered her hand, palm open, not reaching, simply allowing. Ranger touched his nose once to her glove, then sat down. That, more than her introduction, made Ethan open the door wider. "You weren't at the reading," he said. "No," Eleanor replied. Mr. Alden handled what Margaret wanted seen. She paused, her eyes moving past him to the small table, the envelope, the $2 lying beneath the lamp. "I handled what she wanted protected." The sentence entered the room quietly, but it changed the air. Ethan stepped back. Eleanor wiped her shoes on the mat before coming in, a small courtesy Margaret would have appreciated. She did not look around with pity. She noticed the folded blanket on the chair, the clean mug by the sink, the old service photograph turned face down on the shelf, and she let each thing remain private. Ranger returned to the table and lay beneath it, as if the meeting had been arranged around him all along. Eleanor set her satchel down and removed a thick cream envelope sealed with dark green wax. Pressed into the wax was a single letter M. Ethan recognized Margaret's style immediately. Formal, stubborn, a little theatrical when she believed the occasion deserved it. "She asked me to give you this after the public reading," Eleanor said. "Not before, not in that room, not where they could measure your face." Ethan stared at the envelope but did not take it yet. She knew they'd laugh. Eleanor's expression did not change, though something like regret passed through her eyes. Yes. The honesty landed harder than a comfort would have. Ethan looked away toward the rain-streaked window. That was part of it, part of what she needed to know. "She was dying," Ethan said, his voice still even. "She already knew me. She knew your kindness," Eleanor said. "She needed to know your restraint." Ethan turned back then. Ranger lifted his head. "Why?" Eleanor placed the sealed envelope in his hand. "Because what comes next will test both." The wax felt cool against his palm. For a moment, he was back in Margaret's room during her last good week, watching her sleep with one hand resting on Ranger's head. He remembered her waking suddenly and saying, "Promise me you won't confuse inheritance with reward." He had thought it was the medication talking. Now he was not sure. Eleanor reached into her satchel again and took out a folded instruction sheet. "Tomorrow morning at 6:30, I will be waiting downstairs. You are to bring 3 days of clothes, the marked dollar bill, this letter, and Ranger." Ethan almost smiled, but it came out too tired. "Ranger gets named in the instructions?" "Twice," Eleanor said. Ranger's tail tapped once against the floor. Ethan looked at the dog, then back at Eleanor. "Where are we going?" Eleanor closed the satchel with a soft click. "North." "That's not an answer. It is the only one Margaret allowed me to give tonight." She moved toward the door, then stopped with her hand on the knob. For the first time, the careful attorney seemed simply old, rain-soaked, and carrying a promise that had become heavy. "Mr. Mercer, your aunt did not leave you $2. She left you a decision. The money was only the key small enough for everyone else to overlook." Then she was gone, her footsteps fading down the narrow stairs. Ethan stood in the quiet apartment with the sealed envelope in his hand. Ranger came to him and pressed his head against Ethan's leg, steady as a vow. Outside, the rain kept falling, but now it sounded less like an ending and more like something being washed clean. Ethan did not open Margaret's letter right away. He set it on the kitchen table beside the $2, then stood over it as if it might breathe. The green wax seal held the shape of her initial, with that same impossible neatness she had brought to everything. Folded towels, handwritten lists, apologies she owed no one, thank you notes to nurses who had only done what kindness required. Ranger climbed onto the old braided rug near the table and lowered himself with a sigh. But his eyes stayed open. Ethan made coffee he did not want. He rinsed the mug before using it, because Margaret had always said old bitterness ruined fresh things. Then, sometime after midnight, when the rain had thinned to a mist and the traffic outside had become an occasional hush, he broke the seal. Inside were 4 pages of cream paper, written in Margaret's hand, the lines steady at first, then smaller toward the end, as if her strength had been spending itself sentence by sentence. "My dear Ethan," it began, "if you are reading this, then I have already asked more of you than I had any right to ask. I let you sit in that room. I let them laugh. I know that is a hard thing to forgive." Ethan stopped there. His jaw tightened, not with anger exactly, but with the ache of being known too precisely. He looked toward Ranger, who had lifted his head at the sound of the paper. Ethan continued, "I did not do it because I doubted your love. You proved that in ways money could never count. You came when the others called my illness inconvenient. You learned the names of my medications. You remembered that I liked my soup hotter than the doctors preferred. You brought Ranger even on the mornings when I pretended not to need him. You sat beside me when the room smelled of bleach and fear, and you never once made me feel like a burden." The words blurred for a moment, and Ethan pressed the heel of his hand against one eye, hard enough to stop whatever wanted to rise there. He had not cried at the funeral. He had not cried in the lawyer's office. Grief had been too busy inside him, moving furniture, locking doors, taking inventory. Margaret's letter opened one of those doors without asking. "But kindness is not the only thing required for what I am leaving you," she wrote. "Kind men can be broken by insult. Honest men can be tempted by comfort. Lonely men can mistake peace for escape. So I needed to see whether you could be humiliated and remain whole, whether you could be wronged and not become cruel, whether you could receive almost nothing in public and still carry yourself like a man who knows his worth was never theirs to assign." Ethan lowered the page. The apartment seemed smaller than before, the yellow lamp gathering the table, the envelope, the old dog, the cooling coffee into one quiet circle. He thought of Victor's laugh, Patricia's lowered eyes, Gordon turning in his chair as if inspecting damaged goods. He had wanted, for one brief hot second, to say something that would leave a mark. Instead, he had left with Ranger. Margaret had seen that future from her deathbed and planned around it. That frightened him more than he wanted to admit. He read on. "A man can lose a uniform and still keep his honor. A family can share blood and still forget mercy. What I am leaving you is not a reward. It is not repayment. It is not a fortune meant to prove that you were secretly the favorite. That would be too small, and you were never small to me. What I am leaving you is a door. Behind that door are people who have been reduced by others to problems, expenses, old stories, empty rooms, signatures on forms. I need you to see them as people before anyone convinces you to see them as numbers. Ranger rose then, slow and deliberate, and came to stand beside Ethan's chair. His nose touched the edge of the paper, not enough to disturb it, just enough to be present. Ethan's throat worked once. The letter continued. Trust him. I wrote those words on the dollar because Ranger has always known who needed a hand before I did. When he stops, you stop. When he refuses a room, look closely. When he rests beside someone, listen. He does not understand money. That is why I trust him more than most people who do. Tomorrow Eleanor will take you north. You will be shown something I protected for 25 years. You may feel angry. You may feel trapped. You may want to turn around before you understand. Do not decide too quickly. Stay long enough to learn names. Stay long enough to be inconveniently moved. At the bottom of the final page, the writing grew faint but unmistakable. The $2 are not your inheritance. They are proof that the smallest thing, held by the right hands, can open the largest door. Ethan sat back, the letter resting against his chest. Ranger placed his head on Ethan's knee. Warm, heavy, patient. Outside, the mist silvered the fire escape. Inside, for the first time since Margaret died, Ethan felt not comfort, but direction. At 6:20 the next morning, Ethan stood on the curb below the shoe repair shop with a duffel bag in one hand. Margaret's letter folded inside his jacket, and the marked dollar tucked into his wallet behind his old veteran ID. The sky had not decided whether to clear or rain again. It hung low over the street, pale and tired, while the first delivery trucks moved through Lancaster County with their headlights on. Ranger sat beside him, alert but calm, his leash loose in Ethan's hand. He had refused breakfast except for 2 bites, which usually meant weather or memory was working on him. At 6:30 exactly, a moss-green Volvo wagon pulled to the curb. It was old enough to have character, and clean enough to have been loved. Eleanor Price stepped out wearing the same charcoal coat, her silver hair tucked beneath a knitted hat, and opened the rear door before saying good morning. Ranger climbed in without being invited. Ethan noticed that. He's been in this car before, Eleanor said. With Margaret? Ethan asked. Eleanor looked at the dog through the open door. Many times. The answer settled between them with a strange tenderness. Ethan placed his duffel in the back and slid into the passenger seat. The car smelled faintly of leather, peppermint, and Margaret's cedar soap. On the dashboard, tucked near the vent, was a tiny brass compass. Ethan had seen it once on Margaret's bedside table during her last winter. He had asked where it came from, and she had said, "From a place I should have taken you sooner." He had thought she meant Cape Cod. Maybe Maine, some summer memory she was too weak to finish. Eleanor pulled into the road, and for the first 20 minutes neither of them spoke. The city edges gave way to farms, wet fields, stone walls, and bare trees holding beads of rain at the tips of their branches. Ranger sat upright in the back, nose angled toward the cracked window, breathing in the morning as if the road had a scent he recognized. Ethan watched him in the mirror. "How long did she keep this from me?" Eleanor kept her eyes ahead. "Long enough to believe she was protecting you." "From what?" "From being asked before you were ready." Ethan let that answer sit. He had learned that some answers were not doors. Some were porches. You stood on them a while before going in. They crossed into New York. Then farther north, the highway thinning into smaller roads where gas stations became less frequent and the trees pressed closer. By late morning, Vermont rose around them in soft green-brown folds, maple woods, white church steeples, red barns weathered at the seams. The rain had stopped. Mist lifted from the fields in long strips, and somewhere beyond a ridge, a river moved unseen but steady. Eleanor finally spoke again. Margaret bought the first piece of land in 2001. Everyone thought it was an investment. She let them think that. What was it? A promise she had made to someone who once gave her a bed when no one else would. Ethan turned toward her. Eleanor did not continue. Not yet. The road narrowed after a town called Maple Falls, though town was generous for a main street, a post office, a diner with a hand-painted sign, and a hardware store that still advertised storm windows in block letters. They passed a cemetery on a hill and a field where 3 horses stood with their backs to the wind. Ranger rose before Ethan saw the turn. His paws braced against the floor, ears high, body suddenly awake with purpose. Eleanor slowed. On the right, half hidden by overgrown lilacs, a gravel lane curved beneath a wooden arch. The sign hanging from it was silvered by age, the letters carved deep and dark, Hollow Creek Haven. Beneath that, smaller words read, a place to be remembered. Eleanor stopped at the entrance but did not drive in. Margaret said he should cross first. Ethan looked back. Ranger was already waiting at the door, eyes fixed on the lane beyond the arch. Ethan stepped out and opened it. The shepherd jumped down, then paused with his nose lifted, taking in the land like a man returning to a house where every room still knew his name. Then he walked forward, not fast, not excited, certain. Ethan followed, gravel shifting under his boots. The lane bent through a stand of maples and opened into a wide hollow washed in morning light. 14 white cottages with green roofs stood in a loose circle around a common house. Smoke lifted from one chimney. A small chapel sat near the creek, its bell dark against the sky. Garden beds waited under straw. An old barn leaned but did not surrender. Ethan stopped without meaning to. He had expected property. Land, a secret asset. He had not expected warmth. He had not expected windows glowing gold in the late morning, or wind chimes moving softly on a porch, or Ranger trotting ahead toward a woman in a navy sweater who had just stepped outside with both hands pressed to her mouth. She looked at the dog first, then at Ethan, and her eyes filled before she smiled. "You must be Margaret's boy," she said. Ranger reached her and leaned against her legs, like he had finally delivered what he had been carrying all along. The woman in the navy sweater introduced herself as Mara Whitfield, though Ranger seemed to require no introduction at all. He pressed his shoulder into her knees, and she laughed once through the shine in her eyes, the kind of laugh that was half relief and half memory. "He remembers the kitchen," she said, touching the gray at his muzzle. "Margaret used to sneak him toast when she thought I wasn't looking." Ethan stood a few steps behind, feeling suddenly like an intruder in a place where even his dog had history. The common house smelled of coffee, wood smoke, lemon oil, and something warm rising in the oven. Not fancy, not institutional, lived in. A long farm table ran through the center of the room, scarred by years of plates, elbows, puzzle pieces, and hands that needed something solid to rest on. Along one wall were shelves of labeled mugs, each name written by hand: Walt, June, Thomas, Ruth, Gloria. Mara took one down that said Margaret in faded blue ink, looked at it for a moment, then placed it back without comment. She said, "You'd be taller." Someone called from near the window. An old man in a cardigan sat beneath a reading lamp, repairing the tiny brass gears of a clock no larger than his palm. His fingers trembled, but his eyes were bright and exact. "That's Walter Green," Mara said. "Walt fixes things that have no business still working." "That includes most of us," Walt said. Ethan nodded, unsure whether to smile. Ranger walked to Walt and sat beside his chair. The old man's hand lowered to the dog's head with the ease of a habit older than grief. "There you are, soldier," Walt whispered, though he was looking at Ranger, not Ethan. Across the room, a woman with silver hair pinned carefully at the back of her head sat before an upright piano, touching one key at a time as if asking permission from each note. Mara lowered her voice. "Ruth Coleman. Played church piano for 52 years. Some mornings her hands forget. Some mornings they remember for both of them." Ruth struck 3 notes, paused, then found the 4th. The small melody hung there, thin but brave. Near the fireplace, Mrs. June Bellamy looked up from a book of poetry, her glasses low on her nose. "Margaret's nephew," she said, not asking. "You have her eyes when you're trying not to feel something." Ethan looked away too quickly. June smiled as if she had not meant to embarrass him. Mara led him through the back hall, past a bulletin board filled with grocery lists, appointment reminders, a church supper flyer, and a handwritten note that said, "Please do not move the blue chair. Thomas needs it by the east window." Outside, the cottages formed a loose circle around the green. Each porch had its own small declaration of personhood: wind chimes, tomato pots, a bird feeder, a faded Red Sox flag, a row of polished stones, a wreath made of dried lavender. "This isn't assisted living," Mara said. "Not exactly. It isn't a facility." Margaret hated that word. She said facilities were where people were stored. Homes were where people were known. Ethan heard the lesson in it and resisted the urge to call it sentimental. There was nothing sentimental about the wheelchair ramp repaired with new boards, the medication chart clipped inside the pantry, the generator shed, the stack of unpaid invoices on Mara's desk when they passed her office. Care, he was beginning to understand, was not soft. It was relentless. Ranger moved ahead of them, stopping at Cottage 6. He did not scratch or bark, he simply sat. Mara's face changed. "Thomas," she said softly. "He doesn't always come to breakfast." Ethan followed her onto the porch. Inside, Thomas Avery sat in a chair facing a window, broad hands folded over a plaid blanket, his face still as winter ground. He was 68, maybe older in the eyes, with a veteran's cap resting on the table beside him. Ranger crossed the room and laid his head on Thomas's knee. For a long moment nothing happened. Then Thomas's hand moved, slow as thawing water, and settled between Ranger's ears. "Morning, boy," he said, voice rough from disuse. Mara blinked and turned slightly toward the wall, giving the moment privacy. Ethan felt something loosen in him, not pity. He disliked pity. This was recognition, and it carried more weight. By the time they returned to the common house, lunch had been set out without ceremony. Vegetable soup, thick bread, butter in a white dish, coffee strong enough to stand on its own. No one asked Ethan what he had inherited. No one asked what he planned to do with the land. They asked whether he took cream, whether Ranger still disliked thunder, whether Margaret had suffered at the end. Ethan answered the last question carefully. "She was herself," he said. June closed her book. That's no small mercy. Later, standing near the window, Ethan watched Ranger lie down in the center of the room where anyone could reach him. Walt's clock ticked again. Ruth found the rest of her melody. Thomas had come in silently and taken the blue chair by the east window. For the first time since the lawyer read the will, Ethan understood that Margaret had not hidden money from her family. She had hidden people from them. And maybe, he thought, there were reasons a woman protected a place like this from anyone who knew the price of land, but not the worth of a name. After lunch, Eleanor asked Ethan to meet her in Margaret's old office, a narrow room behind the common house pantry where the window faced the creek and the desk had been worn smooth at the elbows. Nothing in the room looked rich. There was a green banker's lamp, a brass letter opener, 3 shelves of binders, and a framed photograph of Margaret standing beside Ranger in front of the wooden sign at the gate, her hand resting on his head as if he were the only witness she fully trusted. Mara came in last, carrying a folder against her chest. She looked less like a host now, and more like someone preparing to hear a doctor say there were no simple options left. Ranger followed Ethan inside, circled once beneath the desk, and lay down across his boots. Eleanor opened the first binder. "Hollow Creek Haven is held by the Margaret Whitaker Living Trust," she said. "As of 7 o'clock this morning, you are the sole acting director and primary beneficiary." Ethan stared at her. The words had the clean shape of law and the weight of a trap. "I don't know how to run a place like this." Margaret knew that, then she chose wrong. Mara's eyes moved to him, not offended, only tired. "She chose someone who would say that out loud," she said. "That already puts you ahead of most people who think they know enough." Eleanor turned a page. "The property includes 300 acres, 14 cottages, the common house, chapel, barn, gardens, equipment, and the endowment account. Current value of the account is approximately $3.8 million. The number should have filled the room. Instead, it seemed to shrink under Mara's silence. Ethan looked from one woman to the other. "Why do you both look like that isn't good news." Mara placed her folder on the desk and slid over a sheet of figures. "Because caring for people costs more than admiring the idea of caring for people." Ethan read the columns slowly. Utilities, medical transportation, food, insurance, repairs, staff, property tax adjustments, heating oil, generator maintenance. The annual cost was nearly $680,000. The trust income covered less than a third of it. Donations had slowed after Margaret got sick. 2 grant applications sat unfinished. The barn roof needed work. Cottage 11 needed new plumbing before winter. "How long?" Ethan asked. Eleanor did not soften it. 6 years if nothing changes. Less if markets turn badly. Less still if a serious repair comes due. Outside, the creek moved over stones with a patient sound, as if it had heard worse and would keep going anyway. Ethan looked toward the photograph of Margaret. He could almost hear her voice. "Don't flinch from numbers, Ethan. Numbers don't become cruel until people hide behind them," Eleanor continued. "There is one condition. You must remain involved for 12 months before you can sell, close, transfer, or substantially alter the mission of Hollow Creek Haven. You may appoint advisors. You may bring in help, You may restructure operations. But you cannot simply walk away and sign papers from a distance. Ethan gave a humorless breath. She knew I'd want to. She knew you might be afraid to stay, Eleanor said. That landed closer to the truth than he liked. Ethan had slept in temporary rooms for years, barracks, rentals, guest rooms, motel beds near hospital exits. Staying had always sounded noble until someone needed you past the point where leaving could be polite. Ranger shifted, pressing his body more firmly across Ethan's boots, a living weight pinning him gently to the floor. Mara opened another folder. No one here is pretending this place runs on warm feelings. Margaret was careful, but she was also private. Too private. We need systems. We need community partners. We need the farm store reopened. We need someone who can sit with spreadsheets without forgetting there are people behind them. I drove medical supply trucks, Ethan said quietly. I handled schedules, inventories, weather delays, fuel reports. Nothing like this. Nothing is ever like this, Mara said. Until it is. For a while no one spoke. From the next room came the soft clatter of dishes, Ruth testing a piano note, Walt laughing at something too small to explain. Ethan looked at the papers again and saw what Victor would see. Land, risk, expense, liability. Then Ranger lifted his head toward the hallway, where Thomas had paused just outside the open door, one hand resting on the frame, not entering, not listening exactly, but needing to know whether the new man was already leaving. Ethan folded the top sheet once, then unfolded it. Buying time he no longer had. I'll stay 3 days, he said. Eleanor watched him. Mara did too. Ranger's tail tapped the floor one time. Ethan swallowed. And I'll read everything before I decide what kind of man I'm going to be. By the second afternoon, Ethan had learned that Hollow Creek Haven had two kinds of quiet. There was the morning quiet, full of kettles, footsteps, Ranger's nails clicking across the common house floor, Walt clearing his throat before announcing the weather, as if he had been appointed by Vermont itself. Then there was the afternoon quiet. When the cottages settled, the creek took over the conversation, and the people who had spent their lives being useful allowed themselves to rest without apology. Ethan was in Margaret's office with 3 binders open when he saw the black SUV come through the front gate. It did not belong to anyone there. The vehicle was too polished for the gravel lane, too confident in a place that asked people to slow down before entering. Ranger, who had been asleep under the desk, opened his eyes before the tires reached the common house. He stood, stretched once, and walked to the window. Ethan already knew. Victor Langford stepped out in a navy overcoat, carrying no umbrella though the sky was threatening rain. Behind him came a younger man Ethan recognized from the lawyer's office but had not heard speak much. Daniel Langford, Victor's brother, mid-40s, soft around the eyes in a way Victor was not, holding a leather folder against his chest like a shield. Mara appeared on the porch before Ethan reached the door. She did not smile. "Mr. Langford," she said, "this is private property." Victor looked past her at the cottages, the barn, the maple line, the long sweep of land rolling toward the creek. His face changed the way some men's faces changed at auctions. Not wonder. "Family property," he said smoothly. "For now at least." Ethan stepped onto the porch. Ranger came with him and stopped at the top step, not blocking the path exactly, but making the path feel chosen. Victor glanced at the dog and gave a small laugh. "Still carrying your witness around, Mercer?" Ethan said nothing. He had discovered that silence bothered Victor more than disagreement. Daniel looked at Ranger with something like recognition, then looked away. Victor held out his hand. Ethan did not take it quickly, but he took it because Margaret would have expected manners until manners became dishonest. "I heard there was a misunderstanding," Victor said, "about what Aunt Margaret left behind." "No misunderstanding," Ethan said. "Eleanor explained it clearly. Then she explained the debt too, I hope." Victor opened his arms toward the green, as if presenting a problem he had already solved. 14 cottages, aging infrastructure, medical costs, staff, insurance, heating oil, all sitting on 300 acres of prime Vermont land, beautiful land, developable land. "Ethan, I'm going to say the thing everyone here is too sentimental to say. This place is bad math." Behind Ethan, Mara's face remained still, but her hand closed around the porch rail. Ranger looked at her, then back at Victor. Ethan felt the old heat rise in him, the kind that asked for a sharp answer. Margaret's letter held him by the collar. Be wronged and not become cruel. "They have names," Ethan said. Victor blinked. Excuse me? The people you're turning into math. Victor sighed, patient in the way men become patient when they think patience makes them superior. I'm not the enemy here. I'm trying to help you avoid being buried under someone else's dream. Sell now. We can structure it cleanly. After taxes, after relocation costs, you still walk away with more money than you'll see in 10 lifetimes. Relocation costs, Mara repeated. Her voice was quiet enough to make Daniel look at her. Victor nodded. Appropriate placements. Better equipped facilities. Places designed for this stage of life. The phrase moved through Ethan like cold water. Appropriate placements. He thought of Thomas in the blue chair by the east window. Ruth's hands hovering over the piano. June correcting a line of Dickinson from memory. Walt labeling a repaired clock with the date and his initials because proof of usefulness still mattered to him. Placed, Ethan said. One word, flat and careful. Victor misunderstood the softness for weakness. Exactly, humanely, of course. Ranger stepped down one stair, no growl. Just a dark, steady presence between the porch and the man who had not bothered to learn a single name. Daniel finally spoke. Victor, maybe we should at least see the financials before. I've seen enough, Victor said. Land like this doesn't stay hidden forever. Ethan looked at Daniel then. Really looked. There was discomfort in him, and discomfort, Ethan had learned, was sometimes the first honest thing a person owned. You want to see the financials? Ethan asked. Come tomorrow morning, 7:30. Bring coffee, not a sales pitch. Victor smiled as if Ethan had amused him. You're delaying the inevitable. Ethan looked past him to the cottages, where warm squares of light had begun to appear one by one against the gray afternoon. Maybe, he said. Or maybe I'm learning the difference between value and price. Victor's smile thinned. He turned toward the SUV, leaving Daniel to follow. Daniel hesitated at the bottom of the steps. Ranger approached him and sniffed his hand. Daniel did not move away. Something in his face folded inward, brief and private. He remembers me? Daniel asked softly. He remembers what people bring into a room, Ethan said. Daniel nodded once, as if the answer had cost him something, then left with his brother. When the SUV disappeared beyond the gate, Mara exhaled for what seemed like the first time in minutes. Ethan looked down at Ranger. The dog was watching the road, ears forward as if he knew this was not over. Ethan knew it too. But for the first time, the question was no longer whether Hollow Creek Haven was worth saving. The question was whether Ethan was willing to become the kind of man who could save it without losing himself. The rain began after supper. Not hard at first, just a thin tapping on the common house windows, while Mara reviewed supply invoices and Daniel Langford sat across from Ethan with his sleeves rolled up, looking smaller without Victor's certainty beside him. He had arrived that morning with 2 coffees, as asked, and no sales pitch, which Ethan considered a beginning, though not yet a virtue. All day they had worked through numbers that did not forgive anyone's good intentions. Heating oil, medication transport, insurance, roof repairs, payroll, the unfinished grant for rural elder care. Daniel knew spreadsheets the way Walt knew clock gears, and by 9 that night even Mara had stopped looking at him like an intruder. Ranger slept beneath the table, one paw resting over Ethan's boot. Outside, Hollow Creek Haven folded itself into darkness. Cottage lights went out one by one. Ruth's piano had gone quiet. Thomas had taken the blue chair cushion back to his room. June Bellamy had corrected everyone's pronunciation of Amherst during dinner, then disappeared into Cottage 9 with her book of poems tucked under one arm. At 10:30, Mara closed the last folder. Enough, she said. Numbers don't get kinder after midnight. Ethan almost smiled. Daniel rubbed his eyes. They do get uglier. That means you're reading them correctly, Mara said. Ethan went to Margaret's old guest room behind the office, though sleep did not come cleanly. Rain thickened against the roof. The old building creaked and settled. Sometime after midnight, Ranger lifted his head. Ethan opened his eyes before he knew why. The room was dark except for the gray wash of rain at the window. Ranger stood beside the bed, ears high, body still in that terrible certain way Ethan had learned not to question. What is it? Ethan whispered. Ranger went to the door and looked back once. Ethan was on his feet in seconds. He pulled on his boots, coat, and cap, then stepped into the hall. The common house was quiet but not peaceful. A thread of cold air moved through it. Mara came out of her room almost immediately, tying her robe tight, her face awake with fear before she asked the question. Who? Ranger was already at the back door, nose low. Mara checked the board by the hall, where each resident's evening marker should have been turned inward. Her hand stopped at one name, June. Daniel appeared behind her, pale, jacket half-zipped. What happened? Mara did not waste breath. Mrs. Bellamy isn't in her cottage. The rain had turned the paths slick and silver. Ranger led them across the green, not running, but moving with such focus that the three humans had to trust the shape of his certainty. Cottage 9 stood empty, the bed neat, one lamp still burning, June's slippers missing. On her table lay an open poetry book and a small handwritten note that said, "First bell 8:15. Ethan looked at it, and something in him understood before Mara spoke. "She taught high school English for 34 years, Mara said softly. "When she gets tired, time loosens." Ranger pulled toward the chapel path. The creek was louder there, swollen by rain, moving black beneath the footbridge. Ethan's flashlight caught wet leaves. The white side of the chapel, the bell rope moving slightly in the draft beneath the eaves. Ranger climbed the steps and stopped. June Bellamy sat on the top stair in her raincoat, soaked at the hem, her gray hair flattened to her cheeks, her poetry book hugged against her chest. She was shivering, but when she saw Ethan, she straightened with fragile dignity. "I'm late," she said. "The seniors are presenting today. I promised I wouldn't forget them." Mara started forward, worry breaking through her voice. Ethan lifted one hand gently, not to stop her care, but to slow the world down. He crouched a few feet away, letting the rain touch his shoulders, letting June keep the small throne of the chapel step. Ranger moved beside her and laid his head against her knee. Her trembling hand found his fur. "Mrs. Bellamy," Ethan said, quiet as a classroom before the first page turns. "They know you came." June looked at him uncertain. "They do?" "Yes, Mom, every one of them. But the room is cold, and no good teacher starts class before everyone is safe and warm." Something in her face shifted, not corrected, not shamed, met. She looked down at Ranger. "He came for attendance." "He did," Ethan said. "He takes it seriously." Daniel made a small sound behind him, not laughter, not quite grief, but the sound of a man realizing tenderness required more courage than cleverness. Mara wrapped a blanket around June's shoulders. Together they helped her stand, slowly, respectfully, as if bringing home not a lost old woman, but a beloved teacher after a long day. Ranger walked pressed to her side all the way back. By the time June was warm in the common house with tea between her hands, Ethan knew his 3 days were over. Not because he was leaving, because he had already stayed. The first thing Ethan changed at Hollow Creek Haven was not the budget. It was the morning roll call. Margaret had kept names on mugs, charts, folders, prescriptions, and door frames. But Ethan asked Walt to make a wooden board for the common house wall, smooth oak, hand-sanded, with brass hooks and small nameplates for every resident, every staff member, and one at the bottom for Ranger. People should know they are expected, Ethan said when Mara asked why it mattered. Walt did not answer right away. He only ran his thumb over the grain of the wood and nodded once, as if Ethan had repaired something no invoice could name. Spring came slowly to Vermont. Snow loosened from the stone walls. The creek rose, then settled. The garden beds turned dark and workable under Mara's hands. Daniel stayed longer than anyone expected, first for the financials, then for the grant applications, then because Ruth discovered he could tune a piano well enough to make her scold him with affection. He never made a speech about becoming a better man. He simply began showing up before breakfast with coffee, spreadsheets, and less of the careful emptiness he had carried in Victor's shadow. Together, he and Ethan reopened the farm store near the road. They sold honey in square jars, eggs in blue cartons, carved birdhouses from the old barn wood, Ruth's recipe cards, and Walt's repaired clocks with a small tag that read, "Still keeping time." Mara hated the tag at first, then bought one for her office. The first grant came through in June. Not enough to save everything, but enough to buy time. Then a local church offered volunteers for repairs. A veterans group donated a transport van. The Maple Falls Gazette wrote a story about the place Margaret Whittaker had hidden in plain sight, and letters began arriving from people who remembered someone they had failed to visit soon enough. Ethan read every letter. He answered most of them by hand. Victor returned once in late July, driving the same black SUV, wearing the same smooth confidence, though it sat less comfortably on him now. He stood near the gate and looked at the cottages, the painted porch rails, the farm store sign, the open windows, Ranger asleep in the shade beside Thomas. "You're delaying the inevitable," Victor said. Ethan looked toward the common house, where June was leading Daniel through a line of Dickinson, and Ruth was laughing because he kept getting the pause wrong. "Maybe," Ethan said, "but some things deserve to be delayed until people remember what they're about to lose." Victor offered more money. Ethan let him finish. Then he said no, not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly enough for the land to hear it. "You saw acreage," he said. "Margaret saw people. I'm choosing her vision." Victor left before supper. Daniel stayed. By September, the board by the door was full. No one called Hollow Creek Haven a facility anymore, not if Ethan could hear it. It was a home, and homes had leaks, bills, quarrels over soup, birthdays, lost glasses, found songs, and dogs who knew which chair needed quiet company. On the first cold morning of October, a gray sedan stopped outside the gate. An older man stepped out slowly, wearing a brown coat too light for the weather, and holding a canvas bag against his chest. He stood under the sign for a long moment, reading the words, "A place to be remembered." Ranger rose from the porch before anyone spoke. Ethan watched him cross the yard, steady and certain, then sit beside the stranger's leg, as if the man had been expected all along. The man looked at Ethan, embarrassed by his own hope. "Is this the place Mrs. Whitaker built?" he asked. Ethan felt Margaret there then, not as a ghost, but as a hand on the work. A voice in the walls, a name still being spoken because people had refused to let it vanish. He opened the door wider. "Yes, sir," he said. "Come in. We've been keeping a chair warm." And as Ranger walked in beside the man, Ethan finally understood the $2, the laughter, the road north, the letter, the test, the trust, and the old promise Margaret had hidden inside a simple instruction. The inheritance had never been money. It had been the chance to become a man who answered. If this story moved you, take a second to like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. And I'd love to know which moment stayed with you most. The $2 inheritance, Ranger finding June, or Ethan opening the door at the end.